Yeah, liebe Kollegen and dear colleagues, it's a great pleasure and honor for me to welcome you to this, I guess, wonderful event, to our tool gallery on spoken corpus linguistics and open access, with a focus on usability and technology of Voice 3.0 online. And I'm welcoming you in my function as Director of the Austrian Center for Digital Humanities and Cultural Heritage, the ACDH-CH. So this institute is one of the largest institutes of the Austrian Academy of Sciences. And since 2020, it has been bringing together two focal points of the Austrian Academy of Sciences, namely, on the one hand, basis research in the humanities and long-term projects, for the development and preservation of text, language, music, cultural heritage, and research in the methodological and theoretical paradigms of digital humanities. The main research paradigms of the Institute's focus, as I already said, on text, language, and music, and these focal points are also reflected in the Institute's structure, which includes a Department for Linguistics. And I'm very pleased that Marie-Luise Pitzl and her research activities around the great voice corpus are also part of this linguistic research department. And the Tool Gallery, a series of the Austrian Center for Digital Humanities and Cultural Heritage, in which this special Tool Gallery is located. This series is a workshop series dedicated to providing you, all participants, with hands-on training and practical insights into the use of specific tools, especially in the field of digital humanities. The topics of this two-day tool gallery are spoken corpus linguistics and open access technology. So open access is often regarded, as a gold standard for any corpus, for any language or text corpus, and yet after project's completion, it's often very challenging to keep the corpus accessible in long-term perspective, despite the fact that the compilation of corpora is often time and cost intensive. So by using VOICE, the Vienna-Oxford International Corpus of English, and its web application VOICE 3.0 as example, this tool gallery, this workshop will provide insights into the development of and the technology behind this open access application. So we are therefore very happy and pleased to have one as a workshop leaders, the team of the VOICE CLARIAH project under the head of Marie-Luise Pitzl. So Marie-Luise is an applied linguist who has done extensive research on corpus linguistics and communication, interaction, verbal interaction in English, especially with a focus on English as lingua franca. And from the beginning of the VOICE project, she has been involved in the creation of this corpus. On the workshop's first day, let's have a look on the program. On the workshop's first day, Marie-Luise will demonstrate together with Ruth aus dem Tiestal from the Johannes Kepler University in Linz, and together with Stefanie Riegler from the University of Vienna, how this corpus can be used as an open access tool for linguistic research. And tomorrow then Oma Siam and Hannes Pirker from the ACDH-CH will then focus on the technologies behind the open access application. So I would like to thank our colleagues, the VOICE team, for taking time and sharing their knowledge and competences and insights with the participants of this tool gallery. And I wish you all 2 very exciting workshop days. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra Lenz, for this kind introduction. We're excited to be here with you today. Here being a virtual here as it is these days, but it's really nice to see some familiar faces and some unfamiliar, not yet faces, but names, and some familiar names. We hope we have a good program planned for you, and then we're very happy that as I will explain also in a little while, that Voice has found a new home together with me in a way, also having found a new temporary home at the Austrian Academy of Sciences at the ACDH-CH. So yeah, this is where we would welcome you physically, and this is where we would welcome you virtually today. So without further ado, I will dive into sort of the bigger picture of spoken corpora and the challenge of long-term open access, because open access is great and it's wonderful, but it's not especially easy if you build a corpus, which is usually the case with third-party funding. So I will tell you from the perspective of Voice how we have managed to keep us online for by now 1.5 decades almost. So very briefly, in the beginnings, some people of you are familiar with ELF research, some of you may be a little bit or not so much. From the early 2000s onwards, people like Barbara Seidelhofer, who you will also see in the audience joining us today, became interested in investigating empirically how English is used as an additionally acquired language system that serves as a means of communication between speakers of different first languages. So that was the birth and the origin of English as a lingua franca as a field of research. And in order to do ELF research, Seidelhofer and others, but especially for Voice, Barbara Seidelhofer argued that we need a broad empirical base on which we can actually do linguistic description. And that was sort of the spark, and that the idea that meant the beginning of the voice corpus. Now, of course, building a spoken corpus, or any corpus for that matter, usually depends on funding. So the proper funded beginning of Voice lies in the year 2005, with Barbara Seidelhofer being the principal investigator of a project funded by the Austrian Science Fund, FWF, with a core team of essentially 4 people. And I happened to be at the time one of these 4 people who was part of the team, who focused in this project on designing the corpus, thinking about the structure, compiling it, doing data collection, selecting data, transcribing data, checking transcripts, and also then transferring the original transcription format into a TEI XML corpus. TEI may be familiar to some of you, the text encoding initiative. We won't be speaking about TEI and XML so much during these days, but you will hear it again and again during our talks, especially also tomorrow, because the fact that Voice has been an XML TEI conform corpus from the beginning, basically, is a crucial part of the work that we were able to do with it also in recent years in terms of revamping the front-end interface. Now, at the time, open access strategies were sort of something that was beginning to appear in descriptions and guidelines of funding bodies like the FWF, but open access, OA, was not a requirement at the time. As many of you will know, since then, there's been a gradual increase and trend toward open access more and more, and rightly so. But at the time, we could have also decided not to make Voice an open access corpus. But the decision, also after quite some discussion in the team, was made that the decision was made that we would make Voice openly available through an online interface, and then eventually also release the XML files. Because we felt that was, a good thing to move forward for the spoken corpus. And I will say, some pros and advantages of why, we thought that was a useful thing to do at the time a little bit later on. After the first Voice project funded by the FWF, we were lucky that there was actually a second project that was funded, again, with Barbara Seidelhofer being principal investigator. But you can see, for various reasons, even though we still had a wonderful team there, the team structure was already, for various reasons, not as stable as in the first project phase. So there were some people who left the team, others who joined the team, among them Ruth, who joined the team in 2009. And Stefan Majewski and myself, for instance, Stefan Majewski being the person who was responsible in the first voice project, essentially for all the technological setup and programming the first online interfaces and everything related to XML, had to leave the team in 2011, and myself as well, for the fun fact that you cannot be funded for longer. At the time, you could not be funded for longer than 6 years by the same research institution. So yeah, there was fluctuation, there were new people coming in, and there were new foci, because the second project first initially focused on completing the corpus and then releasing it as an open access resource. And then the main focus, or major focus of the second project was the lemmatization, and especially part of speech tagging. And Ruth and Michael Radecker were centrally involved in this, and Ruth will tell you more about details of how part of speech tagging was done for voice later on, because for spoken corpus with very interactive data, as you can imagine, English is a lingua franca on top of that, but spoken and interactive alone would be enough. Part of speech tagging is not a minor, but an actually major research undertaking. We also released audio files and the XML files, and then finally in 2013, the part of speech tag version of voice during these projects. Now, this brings me, as I said, to the various releases and versions of voice, all of which happen to be open access. So we have the first release of voice as voice online, voice 1.0 online in 2009, where some of you might have seen this before. We had the old voice, yellow voice interface, which by now looks in terms of design a bit dated, but at the time I think it was quite fashionable and quite good, and definitely very functional. But one of the things that, of course, open access also means is that, first of all, you have to complete everything really on the spot, on a day, and it has to be in pretty good shape to be really released. And it also always means that you have to provide additional documentation. For instance, for the online interface, there was a longish description on the old voice homepage where we described how to actually use the voice online interface. Because when you release something, you kind of need to tell people how it works and what they can do with it. Pretty much like, just having data without metadata information about the data. It's very limiting. So the same is true for open access resources. You always need documentation that goes along with it in order to make it fully usable. And that, of course, is an extra amount of work and takes actually time. In 2010, we then decided, because people had been asking for this, to provide sound files, audio files for selected speech events. And as easy as that sounds, again, it involves actual extra specific work, because first of all, we needed to select which speech events were feasible for this kind of procedure. Some speech events would have content that is too sensitive. Other speech events, for instance, would be super, super noisy, so that no one would be particularly excited to listen to those field recordings with lots of background noise. And then internally, for transcription, the files hadn't been anonymized. The transcripts, however, were. So in order to release the audio file, we, anonymized, not fully in the sense of you can still recognize people's voices if you know them, but we bleeped basically all portions of sensitive content like names or sensitive place names and etc. that were anonymized and replaced by pseudonyms and placeholders in the transcripts, also in the audio files, which is an extra step that needed to be taken. And then, of course, once again, it needed to be implemented. So an audio player had to be put in the online interface and a documentation explaining of how this actually works. We get to the release of Voice XML then, which had already been prepared for the release of online, and we released this a little while later in a download zip package, which not only contained the XMLs, but also the plain text files without any markup, and the derived HTML files, which basically represented and mirrored the transcripts as they were produced and in voice style, and as they can also be seen online. And this is what the first, as an excerpt of what the first XML transcript version basically looked like, which is already quite heavily full with markup, all of this in, again, a TEI conform fashion. Then we moved to Voice 2.0 with some minor corrections being made to transcripts, and most importantly, the part of speech tagging being added. The part of speech tagging was then, again, as I said, built by a team that was slightly different from the first voice team. And when it was completed and released and found so suitable and good enough to be put as open access, there was a second separate online interface built for the part of speech tag version of Voice, which once again, of course, needed to be documented, both in terms of how the part of speech tagging works. So especially Ruth was essential in writing a part of speech tagging and lemmatization manual that explains what you actually get in terms of part of speech tagging. And once again, you needed to provide extra documentation of how this interface actually could be used. So all of these were the Corpus products and the Corpus releases. In addition, there were smaller side products, so to speak, with transcription conventions that had been built over the years. Initially, in the early 2000s, started out, Barbara and colleagues started out with a version of the MyCase, the Michigan Corpus for Academic Spoken English, version of the MyCase transcription conventions that were then developed further and expanded for the needs of ELF research and for the needs of voice. And in the early phases of the first project, we did again 2 major rounds of what more did we need? We added spelling conventions and not only markup conventions. So these were openly available. And then Stefan Majewski, because that is just one of the things he just did, programmed a software called Voicecribe, which is sort of adapted to the voice transcription conventions, and this was also released in 2007. So the transcription conventions were open access, as well as the software, which is, as far as I know, also open source and could be used. It hasn't been actualized, it hasn't been updated for many years. It still runs, but of course, the more new versions of Windows you get, the more tricky it is for it to really fully maintain its function because it hasn't been updated in a while. Now, why did we even want to build a spoken corpus? And why did we think that making this corpus open access was a good idea? As Barbara argued in her influential article in 2001, the reason why an ELF corpus was desirable to be a spoken corpus is because we wanted to be able to observe and work with language at one remove from the stabilizing and standardizing influence of writing, and even more so not just spoken language, but spoken interaction, because from an ELF perspective, it is most interesting to see how things work reciprocally, mutually, to look at production, but also reception, for instance, to get a sense of what is intelligible and what is understandable to speakers. But why make this corpus open access? We could have just built the corpus, kept it to ourselves, and been happy with what we had achieved. And I've compiled from my personal perspective a few of the pros and cons, especially for a spoken corpus, of why during the project it is desirable or also challenging to make a corpus open access. First of all, as you can imagine, without going into the details of this right now, compiling a spoken corpus of naturally occurring interactive conversations recorded in real life context, which are then transcribed in a fairly high amount of detail, is an undertaking that is time, labor, and therefore really cost intense. And therefore, it is desirable to make the data, maximum usable, because so much money and time goes into actually building the corpus. Second, the corpus, if it is open, is not only more visible, but especially more usable for research. So the likelihood that people will actually work with it and carry out studies and publish work on the basis of the corpus is also clearly much higher. Thirdly, in some occasions, it may help actually to convince participants to participate, because you have a reputation, you're more present, there is a bigger purpose to the research endeavor that you're doing for your corpus. So for some participants, when you're trying to convince them to have a recording for the corpus, this may be a pro and this may be a good selling point. For others, it may be the opposite. And finally, of course, it caters to the FAIR principles of scientific data. So the data are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, both when they are open and also when they are used following certain standards in terms of metadata or XML annotation, like the TEI guidelines. Challenges are the fact that building a spoken corpus is in itself a major enterprise. So there are lots of things you have to do, also overlapping and at the same time, without catering to the extra needs of open access. Because as I said, for instance, additional documentation is no small feat, takes up quite a lot of work. And that is not the building of the corpus itself, but that's basically on top of that. Also, a potential con or challenge is that, of course, the people who work on the project and on the corpus lose the exclusive access to the data, even if only this access might be temporarily maintained. If you delay open access for a little while, but it depends on how pressed for time you are, and sometimes delaying you might not want to, or it might also not be a possibility. As I said, sometimes it's an advantage to be open access if you want to convince participants. Sometimes it is a disadvantage. So we also had other PhD candidates at the time in Vienna who were working, for instance, on business contexts, who wanted to record data for their PhDs, and ideally, as far as they were concerned, to also have the data then incorporated into VOICE. But some business participants explicitly said no, they agreed to being recorded for an individual PhD project, but not for an open access corpus, because they just felt safer and just felt that they wanted to have the data less available to others. So we have business data in the VOICE corpus, so clearly you do get access, but it may be much more tricky if it ends up being an open access corpus. And then finally, there is this extra amount of work that you need to do. So you're really making everything open and transparent, also how you did your work. So you really should be quite happy with the consistency of how things are done. You need extra documentation. It should be clear which standards sort of have been used in the compilation of the project. And therefore, a small challenge, speaking also from personal experience, even though it worked out in the end, there are definitely phases where individual research is not just exactly the same as project work, especially if you're catering to things that are open access. It's often not traditional publications, but it is for your PhD project as such. But it's work that has to be done in parallel, and it takes quite a lot of time, as much as we think it is worth doing and rewarding, otherwise we wouldn't have done it. And then the funding ends. And that is where the real challenges actually begin, as Barbara and others may well know, because a corpus is usually built with external third-party money. So it's even more challenging to actually keep it going once it has been released, because that's usually when the funding ends. Advantages to actually keep it alive, clearly, again, are that it's fair and reusable and findable, accessible, etc. And of course, it can be used continuously used for research and also for teaching university courses. With that, however, also comes kind of the expectation that, of course, if you're used, for instance, teaching a university course, used to the corpus being available and working, you kind of expect it to be available and work. And so people have certain demands or needs, or at least just expectations, and they're used to things just going on as they did. But from the project perspective, this is usually not what happens. So cons definitely are that if the team or some members of the team are employed by third-party money, they may no longer work at the host institution for various reasons. Or luckily, in this time, in the VOICE CLARIAH project, we have with Oma and Hannes, two people who really hopefully will be at the ACDH-CH long term. But of course, once your project ends, they are busy with other projects, so that officially they don't really have time devoted to just working on already completed projects that are just maintaining for open access. So almost unavoidably, you lose workforce and project knowledge once the project ends, and that's a challenge for maintaining open access. Obviously, you need technological maintenance, but again, the question is who can actually do this if you don't have someone who stays in the host institution. And then you also need content maintenance. So if there's a project email, for instance, external communication, you need someone somehow who knows things, who will respond to emails, who will be communicating to people if inquiries come in. So eventually, and this is what got us eventually also to today, Corpus will be so long, especially for an online version, that you will need technological updates because there are simply IT changes that happen over time. But in order to proper update, you need funding. But funding is usually something that primarily is given, of course, for the development of new tools and new resources, and not to already existing ones. We are extremely happy that it was possible to get funding to build a new front end for Voice Online. And we'll talk more about the VOICE CLARIAH project later on. But the fact is that hopefully in the future, there might be more funding schemes, maybe not, I don't know, that actually give funding to the maintenance and sort of the revamping of existing resources. But most funding schemes at the moment are not catering to the needs of maintenance or updates, but only to building new tools. So the path of voice in a nutshell, in chronology, has been from the early 2000s with the first ideas and the first project proposals that Barbara, of course, wrote, to the first funded project, the second funded project. Then we've had a pretty long maintaining open access phase post-funding from 2013 to 2020, where, however, it was becoming increasingly clear to us that if we didn't do something, it was only a matter of time until Voice Online would not work at all anymore. So we were lucky to be able to do the VOICE CLARIAH project with a wonderful team of people in the last 2 years, 1.5 years actually. And now we're essentially back in a second post-funding phase because our project officially is over. We're officially no longer a team. We're just a group of people who are fortunately, from my side, fortunately enough, dedicated enough to do this kind of tool gallery and to make sure for some time at least to hopefully keep voice, the new voice as well, alive. But it is and continues to be a challenge. And as much as we believe in doing this kind of work and making the resource available, it is definitely something that is not without its hurdles. And with that, I will stop